Helmut Marko's decision to speak openly after his exit from Red Bull represents one of the most revealing moments in the team's modern history. His comments reframe years of speculation about internal dynamics into a structured explanation of how power, authority, and governance gradually shifted at the top of a dominant Formula One operation. Rather than sounding like emotional reaction, his statements are presented as a retrospective attempt to explain why Red Bull's internal balance changed and why leadership transition eventually became unavoidable in his view. At the center of Marko's account is the contrast between how Red Bull Racing was originally structured and how it evolved after the death of Dietrich Mateschitz. He repeatedly emphasizes that the team was founded as an Austrian-led project, with Mateschitz holding ultimate authority and Marko acting as his closest sporting representative. Within that system, Christian Horner was appointed team principal to carry out decisions, not to reshape the ownership model or redefine the balance of power. This background is important because it explains why Marko interpreted later developments not as normal leadership evolution, but as a departure from the team's original foundation. The passing of Mateschitz in 2022 is presented as the key turning point. Marko describes this period as one in which long-standing organizational safeguards were suddenly no longer in place. In environments like this, uncertainty often emerges, and leadership structures naturally come under pressure. Marko suggests that this moment marked the beginning of a gradual shift in influence within the organization, particularly between different ownership interests. What strengthens Marko's narrative is the level of detail in his recollections. He points to specific moments in 2022 that, from his perspective, signaled a broader change in direction. These experiences are framed not as isolated incidents, but as early indicators of a longer process that reshaped internal decision-making once the team's original authority figure was no longer present to mediate. According to Marko, this process unfolded over several seasons through changes in influence, communication, and internal alignment. He consistently stresses that the resulting tension was not driven by personal conflict, but by differing views on how Red Bull Racing should ultimately be governed. For those familiar with Formula One at an organizational level, this distinction is significant. Teams are not just sporting operations. They are complex institutions where authority, accountability, and ownership priorities intersect behind the scenes. Events in early 2024 are described as fitting into this wider context. Marko does not focus on specific claims or outcomes, but argues that the surrounding uncertainty affected the team at a critical time. As Red Bull's competitive margins tightened, internal distraction made it more difficult to maintain the level of operational clarity required at the highest level of the sport. In Formula One, even small disruptions can have noticeable performance consequences over time. Marko also reflects on his final period with the team as one marked by declining internal trust. He suggests that misunderstandings and miscommunication became increasingly common, creating an environment where confidence between key figures was strained. In an organization built on clear hierarchy and cooperation, such conditions can be damaging to overall stability. The involvement of senior drivers during this period is highlighted as further evidence of how deeply internal matters had begun to overlap with sporting performance. When leading drivers become aware of or affected by organizational uncertainty, it often signals that cohesion within the team is already under pressure. One of the most significant elements of Marko's perspective is his belief that decisive action came too late. He argues that earlier clarity in leadership could have altered competitive outcomes, reframing certain results as consequences of governance challenges rather than purely on-track factors. The team's improved stability following later leadership changes is presented as support for this view, suggesting that clear direction can have an immediate positive effect. Overall, Marko's account challenges the idea that Red Bull's internal changes happen suddenly. Instead, he describes a long, gradual process in which unresolved structural tensions accumulated over time. For longtime observers of Formula One, this pattern is familiar. Teams that dominate for extended periods often struggle not with technical decline, but with internal realignment once the original balance of authority begins to shift. The consequences for Red Bull, as it approaches 2026, are therefore profound. With both Horner and Marko gone, the team is not simply adjusting personnel, but redefining its leadership identity at a moment of unprecedented technical upheaval. The incoming regulatory cycle will demand clarity, decisiveness, and cohesion, qualities that are difficult to establish amid organizational reset. Laurent Mekies inherits an operation with enormous competitive potential, but also the burden of repairing trust after years of internal factionalism. His task is not merely to manage performance, but to stabilize governance in a way that prevents the re-emergence of the dynamics Marko has described. Horner's legacy, viewed through the lens of Marko's testimony, becomes more complex and less linear. There is no disputing Horner's role in building one of the most successful teams in Formula One history, yet Marko's account suggests that the later stages of that success were accompanied by an expansion of influence that unsettled the team's foundational balance. Even if some contest Marko's interpretation, the existence of such a detailed counter-narrative ensures that Horner's tenure will increasingly be analyzed not only through trophies and titles, but through questions of governance, authority, and internal alignment. But the most striking aspect of Marko's statements is their internal consistency. Across interviews and publications, he returns to the same structural themes without contradiction: the shift in power following Mateschitz's death, the alignment with alternative ownership interests, the escalation of internal maneuvering, and the cost of delayed intervention. For an informed audience, this repetition is not redundancy, but reinforcement. It suggests a coherent interpretation rather than a reactive grievance, lending his accounts a level of credibility even among those who may dispute his conclusions. From a wider Formula One perspective, Red Bull's experience reinforces a long-standing truth about the sport. Competitive dominance is sustained not only by engineering excellence, but by disciplined governance. When internal authority becomes contested, technical brilliance alone is rarely sufficient to maintain momentum. Marko's testimony illustrates how instability at the top can gradually seep into every layer of an organization, from strategic decisions to driver management, often becoming visible only when results begin to fluctuate. The timing of these revelations further amplifies their significance. With the 2026 regulations approaching, Red Bull no longer has the luxury of internal experimentation. The loss of two central figures places pressure on the organization to demonstrate institutional maturity rather than individual dominance. Learning from this period is no longer optional. It is foundational to remaining competitive in a reshaped Formula One landscape, where margins will be tighter and adaptability more valuable than ever. For Max Verstappen, the implications are inseparable from his future. His success has been deeply intertwined with Red Bull's internal structure, and Marko's assertion that earlier leadership change could have delivered another title highlights how sensitive driver outcomes are to organizational health. As Verstappen enters the next phase of his career, the stability and clarity of Red Bull's post-Horner, post-Marko era will be as influential as raw performance potential. Ultimately, Marko's bombshell should not be interpreted as a personal vendetta, but as a form of institutional testimony from someone who witnessed Red Bull's evolution from inception to dominance. His account does not demand unquestioned acceptance, but it does demand engagement. It compels observers to reconsider how power was exercised, resisted, and eventually redistributed within one of Formula One's most successful teams. As Red Bull moves forward, these revelations ensure that its recent history will not be remembered as a seamless transition between eras. Instead, it will stand as a case study in how success can generate internal complexity, and how governance decisions, delayed or decisive, shape competitive outcomes just as surely as any aerodynamic upgrade.